Okay, we finished up with paganism, pagan worship in the Old Testament. And I did say that I wanted to make a few concluding remarks about that tonight before we jump into the next section on our outline, or the next topic on our outline. This is one thing I failed to mention, and I really need to mention it under pagan worship, or if we want to give it a better known designation, idolatry in the Old Testament, to make it complete that I didn't say earlier. And that is the following. If there's one thing the fall of Jerusalem in 586 B.C., the captivity of Judah, did for the Jews, was that it cured them from the crass form of idolatry, as we saw in these many, many passages in the Old Testament. We didn't mention them all by name. We just mentioned some, like Asherah and Ashtaroth and Baal and Moloch and Dagon and Rimmon and Marduk and Bel and Tamar and Ishtar and El. But there are probably as many as 40 or 50 by name in the Old Testament. And Israel, sooner or later, made her rounds of worshiping just about all of them. She has that dubious distinction to her credit. The one thing that the fall of the city did in 586 was it pretty much cured them permanently of the crude or the crass form of idolatry, of pagan worship in the Old Testament. And I think that is to be seen by the following two facts. First of all, if we would want to know, and we've seen how she just worshipped one god after another, and I didn't actually give you some of the passages just prior to her fall where the prophets, such as in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, actually go so far as to attribute their fall, at least in measure, to idolatry. I didn't give you those because we're going to look at those tonight under another connection. But if that's what those prophets had to say prior to the fall of the city, then if we would want to know, well, did this 70-year period of captivity, of exile, of deportation, did it cure that in them? Well, then we'd turn to the prophets who came after the Babylonian captivity. And think of who those prophets are. The post-exilic prophets toward the end of your Old Testament. And think of what their prophecies have to say. Someone like Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. What's Haggai's little prophecy about? Well, the building, the restoration of the literal visible temple there. Said, amend your ways and don't be so concerned with your own life and your own homes, but build the Lord's temple, and then he'll bless you to build your own. Zechariah, who's a younger contemporary of Haggai's, is also talking about the temple. But he seems to be talking about a different temple and a different Israel, an Israel many thousands of years in the future, evidently a millennial temple, a millennial Israel in the future. In other words, no references to, Israel, and we're 100 years, let's say, after at least the initial phase of the captivity. Israel, surrender your worship of Asherah and Ashtaroth and Baal. Baalism in post-exilic Israel? Hardly. Baalism? The worship of El or Rimmon or Dagon? You don't find that at all. You find that back during the monarchical period in Israel. And what about Malachi? Well, he's talking about social injustices as well as those of a religious nature in Israel. And you don't have anything concerning idolatry. So there'd be one proof we would ask ourselves. The question, did this period of deportation cure Israel of idolatry? We'd look at the prophets that came afterward. And then secondly, we'd turn, of course, to the New Testament. We've got the rest of the Bible in which to look, which still, at least in some part, deals with Israel. All right? And specifically, I have in mind the Gospels. Now, Jesus had some heated debates and arguments with the religious leaders of his day. But do you remember any that were about Baal or Dagon or Rimmon? In other words, just by virtue of the silence of the Gospels concerning that form of crude or crass idolatry, we would have to assume that it wasn't an issue. Because if it was an issue, I'm sure Jesus would have made an issue out of it. And if it was an issue and he came teaching something that seemed to be contrary to that, I'm sure when one of the deputies of the Sadducees was sent along to ensnare or trap Jesus in some discussion, that would have been brought up. It's not brought up anywhere there. Now, of course, as we get later in the New Testament, many times, at least in Paul's writings, we're dealing with Gentile Christians and other parts of the empire as well. But we know with the four Gospels, we can pretty much stay right inside the confines of Palestine. There are no discussions about idolatry there. So that must mean something happened in Israel concerning Baalism and the worship of these pagan gods, the worship of these demons. The 70-year period of captivity changed that. Now, I don't want to go into it any more than that. But we would like to go into it more, but that would really go way back into a study of that period in Israel's history. Why? Why, of all the times that Israel had to surrender the gods that she worshipped, why then? I mean, she had gone through some catastrophes before. Why then? What was it about that 70-year period that changed Israel so much? Now, over in the New Testament, whenever idolatry is spoken of, it seems to be spoken of in a different sense, in a more subtle sense than in the Old Testament. That's why in the Old Testament I keep referring to it as that crude or crass form of idolatry, where there is either actually a carved image or you're representing, the being behind the sun, something that you can't carve yourself, and you're actually bowing down before that. That's a very crude and crass form of idolatry. But if you'll turn over to Ephesians chapter 5, Paul deals with the subject of idolatry, but it's in a more subtle form, I think, here. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 5. Along with Colossians, I think chapter 3 deals with this as well. But Ephesians 5 and verse 5. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person has any inheritance in the kingdom of God and of Christ. And then he defines one of those, not the immoral or the impure, but he defines one of those, the last in that triology, the greedy person. Such a man is an idolater. Such a man is an idolater. And you find the exact same thing over in Colossians chapter 3, the same verse, verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed. So he gives more than a triology here. He gives several different vices. But again, he qualifies or describes the last of those, greed, which is idolatry. Now, in the Old Testament, greed wasn't characterized by this term idolatry. I mean, that wasn't just something that you'd see. Greed was greed then. Proverbs talks a lot about greed, but it doesn't talk about it as being idolatry. So, of course, Paul, I think, is going a little deeper in his subject and in his thinking of the worship of other gods. The crude, the crass, the rural, primitive thought of idolatry is you bow before an image or a voodoo stick or something like that. And Paul knows that idolatry can be any form of worship of anything besides a true and living God. And it doesn't have to involve itself with the literal bending of the knee. You don't have to have, Paul says, a dollar sign before you and bow before that, literally. But if you're greedy, that means you're bowing before. You might not be bowing with the knee, but you are bowing with the heart. Now, that's really not dealt with in that way in the Old Testament, but it is in the New. In other words, if you're going to talk about idolatry, you really can't talk about pagan worship over here in the New, because that's already been dealt with as far as Israel is concerned. If you were going to talk about it, it would have to concern the Gentiles then. And then one other place is 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 11. And it's interesting that also idolatry comes right after greed. Paul doesn't make the connection that he does in the other two passages, Ephesians 5:5 and Colossians 3:5, but he does mention greed and then idolatry right after it. But now I am writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, or a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. With such a man know not to eat. But it's interesting the way it is set up here. But is sexually immoral or greedy, an idolater, or a slanderer, a drunkard or a swindler. You could almost take that idolatry as being an explanation of greed. But if it's not to be taken that way, then Paul would be referring to Gentiles here in the Corinthian church and not to Jews, because the Jews simply didn't have that problem anymore. So that, in other words, that's pretty much an Old Testament study. That's really not a study of the period between the Testaments, pagan worship or idolatry, because they don't have that problem then. Not in the crude or the crass form in which it's experienced and practiced in the Old Testament. All right, then tonight we come to the subject of the occult. We're talking about religious influences of the Jewish people. And of course you could study these together, because there was the mixing of occult-type practices with pagan worship. But what I mean by occult is anything that has to do with magic. You could, in other words, carve a statue, carve an image, carve an Asherah pole, and bow down before it. And there's no magic involved there. There's just a bowing down before it. But if we get into divination, if we get into hypnosis, if we get into fortune-telling, if we get into ventriloquism, if we get into witchcraft or sorcery or warlocks or white magic or black magic or hocus pocus or voodoo dolls or whatever, then we're into the occult. We've gone beyond just the worship of other gods. And I think what the distinction is here is that in the occult, the worship of demons is more blatant, is more open and obvious. Remember, we concluded last time by looking at a passage in 1 Corinthians 10, where Paul said that whenever the pagans, whether the Gentiles or even Jews in the Old Testament, whenever the pagans are sacrificing to their idols, Paul said they sacrifice unto demons, and I would not have you partake of the cup and of the table of demons, not to partake of them and to partake of that of Christ as well. So we know that he does classify that as actually being a worship of demons. We looked at a couple, or I gave you a couple of Old Testament passages, such as I think Leviticus 17:7 talks about that. But that's not nearly as obvious as the occult. Now, if it's just the occult, what type of god are you worshiping? Well, there's not so much pagan worship where you have a god that goes by name that you're giving allegiance to, that you're offering some sacrifice to. It's just that you're involved in magic. And therefore, if you're involved in some form of magic, it's the same as pagan worship, inasmuch as both of them are participation with evil spirits. Both of them are nothing more than the worship of demons. But with the occult, it's more blatant, it's more open, and it's more obvious. Now, we'll ask some similar questions about Israel and her history with regard to the occult whenever we wrap up this evening. Or you remind me if I forget, just like we did with paganism and idolatry. And we'll see how Israel fared. Well, let's begin with the Old Testament's attitude toward the occult. And again, by occult, I mean anything magical. There are so many different names. The King James Version has many interesting peepers. I think over in Isaiah it talks about peepers, probably referring to ventriloquists. But your more modern versions will have more modern terms. The Old Testament's attitude. How early can we go in the Old Testament to find its attitude? Maybe we should start with that question. How early can we go? Well, let me start with another question. How early can we go? I mean, for a very blatant example, you have to be able to see it in words. How early can we go in the Old Testament to find some reference to idolatry? Where it's got to be in so many words now that they had carried around some gods with them. Don't think of the Tower of Babel now. I think we've got magic and idolatry and everything there. But it's not really blatant there. Laban's personal gods? Anything earlier than that? So we're way back into the book of Genesis then. It is interesting, by the way, that you don't hardly have any references to either idolatry or the occult in the book of Genesis. And whenever you start getting in other portions of the Old Testament, they become much more numerous. I think that's probably due to the fact that Genesis just gives us the narratives of the patriarchs. And somehow we've got to have someone crossing their path or they could be involved themselves, or someone crossing their path that was involved in idolatry or in the occult before you'll find that. Well, yeah, we have to go back to Genesis 31. That's fairly early, but again, that's 31 chapters before we get to Laban. And remember, that's his whole problem, or that's what he uses at least as an excuse on running after Jacob, who's, he said, stolen his sheep and his herds and his 2 daughters and grandchildren and all of this. He said, you took my household gods, my teraphim, as the Hebrew says. You took my household gods. That's in Genesis 31, and then there's another passage. What's the next one after that then? This makes you think about general Bible knowledge, because you got to go, all right, Genesis, and I work my way from Laban and Jacob down to the next of the patriarchs, and in the book of Exodus, and you work your way. Well, this is kind of an obscure one, so you'd be forgiven if you didn't remember this, but it's just 4 chapters later. Same book, just 4 chapters later. Beginning with verse 2, so Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, still involving Jacob now, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you. Purify yourselves and change your clothes. And then come, let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God who answered me in the day of my distress and who has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. And they set out, and the terror of God fell upon the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. Where's the next one after that? What about the interesting one from our point of view to have to deal with, Joseph in Egypt? He asked his servant to put his cup in the sack of Benjamin, his only full brother, and then they take the cup unbeknownst to them, and of course he sends a servant after them and brings him back and said, why did you take my divining cup? Don't you know that I'm a man that can divine? So the implication would be that he had divined through some type of hocus pocus with his cup. And that's given Christian scholars problems dealing with that passage there. So there's how early we could go. But really we have to start later in the Pentateuch. We have to get into the law of Moses before we actually find out the Old Testament's attitude. All we have there, with Laban is Laban did something. Well, that doesn't tell us the Old Testament's attitude. And there with Joseph, it does seem to tell us its attitude that Joseph divined with it, so there's nothing wrong. The only negative passage would be Genesis 35, where Jacob asked them to surrender up their foreign gods. That would appear to be a negative reference to the gods. But you have to go over into the other portions of the Pentateuch, Exodus through Deuteronomy, to really find the Old Testament's attitude. And it's interesting that in the midst of all of these important moral laws that God is giving through Moses, that there are not a few references to sorcery and divination and witchcraft. Now, God comes down on Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. And the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, plus an elaboration of one of those commandments in particular, is given in Exodus chapter 20. Now, how early do you think is the earliest reference there in the law of Moses to the occult? It's very early. Chapter 22. We just jump over 2 chapters. We just have one verse, Exodus 22:18. One of our earliest here in all of the Bible, Exodus 22:18. And it's found in an interesting context of various moral and social duties and responsibilities. One verse, do not allow a sorceress to live. No explanation about it. I think King James says, do not suffer a witch to live. Do not, but we think of witch, with our modern day thinking of long nose and warts and rides on a broomstick. Do not allow a sorceress to live. Of course, you could have those views of a sorceress as well. Now, I wonder how that would have stricken Israel when she heard that, or when Moses heard it. A sorceress. That sounds like capital punishment, and there's no explanation. There's an assumption that Israel's going to have to put this into practice at some time or another. There's just that basic assumption, or God would never have given this to her. But there's no elaboration, there's no forewarning, there's no afterwarning, there's nothing but the bare statement, do not suffer a witch, do not allow a sorceress to live. Capital punishment for a sorceress, whatever that meant to Israel then. And I think that it meant essentially what it means to us today. And then in Leviticus, in chapters 18 through 20, those chapters on nakedness and sexual impurity and so forth, right in the heart of that, Leviticus 19, you find similar references. Leviticus 18 deals with nakedness, and I don't really think it's talking about being naked. It's talking more about sexual relations. And chapter 20 picks that up again. And so sandwiched in between Leviticus 19 and verse 26, the end of 26, do not practice divination or sorcery. We're not going to define all these terms tonight, so don't bog down on that. That'd be for another study. Do not practice divination or sorcery. And then probably some of these other verses are here in this context and so meant to be, such as Leviticus 19:27. Do not cut the hair at the sides of your head. That's generally where I trim mine, on the side as well as every other place. Or clip off the edges of your beard. Well, you'd look like a hobo if you didn't. You see some people who don't trim their beards, and the hair just goes everywhere, like someone stuck their finger in a light socket. Do not cut your bodies for the dead, or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. And then we're back into sexual matters. Do not degrade your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will turn to prostitution and be filled with wickedness. And we can jump down to 31. Do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. So 26b, then 27, then 28, and then 31 are certainly dealing with some forms of the occult. 27 and 28 are the obscure ones because they must refer to some type of customs of which we have little knowledge today. And then notice again it goes into the social realm. Verse 32, rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your Lord. Revere your God. I am the Lord. Why in the context of something like that do we find this business of witchcraft and sorcery? Then in chapter 20 and verse 27, we're just looking at the Old Testament's attitude, the incorporation of Israel and her formation as a nation, which is taking place here in God's wooing and wedding of her through the Exodus. We find that God has a very strong attitude, and it's an attitude that's contrary to all forms of the occult. And it will become more explicit, of course, as we go along. Chapter 20 and verse 27, last verse, a man or a woman, that's a medium. You can have a witch or a warlock or spiritist among you, must be put to death. You are to stone them. Now you see we have more explanations, such as the form of punishment. It's to be by stoning. And their blood will be on their own heads. So don't worry, I won't charge you for that. A man or a woman who's a medium or a spiritist among you must be stoned to death. Now probably the best known passage in the Old Testament on the occult is Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 14. And this is much later. It's a recapitulation of what has gone on prior in Israel's history. Chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. It's a longer section, just tying up loose ends, or repeating some matters, adding other matters, just prior to Israel's entry into the Promised Land. Here's the clearest passage. The others, we know what God's attitude is because he says execute those who are practicing this. But here God tells them what an abominable and detestable practice it is in his eyes, and they are forbidden any form of this in their own worship and religion and life. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire. Now, literally, as you see with a footnote reference there, literally the Hebrew says that you won't cause them to pass through or walk through. But that was because of the certain form of sacrifice. They walked into it. But they weren't like fire walkers, where they caused their sons or their daughters to run through the fire and come out alive on the other side. They put them in the fire to die in the fire. So that's why NIV really doesn't translate. It gives us the interpretation or paraphrase of it. Because the Hebrew says, don't cause them to pass through the fire. Now this could be tied to the occult, or maybe more specifically, it could be tied back to false worship, and particularly the worship of the god Moloch, M-O-L-E or L-O-C-H. This definitely and specifically concerned the worship of the god Moloch. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices or causes to pass through the fire, who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire. Now here we go into that which is blatantly magic. Who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens. Now you can just open the newspaper or go to some sleazy part of town, or sometimes not such a sleazy part of town, and just find palm readers everywhere, you know. I think of just several that come to my mind right now. Just as you turn the corner, there's an old funny sign out there, and it's generally in some rickety old shack. There's a palm reader, one who will read a crystal ball or read your tarot cards. One who interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium, or spiritist, or who consults the dead, a necromancer. Comes from the Greek word for those who are dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. And because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. Now, in one way, you could say, well, maybe the earlier passages are more explicit, because all we're told here is that whoever does this type of deed is detestable to God. Well, they're more than that. They'll be executed by Israel. But we have to go to the earlier passages to find that. Here we're told God's attitude. He hates that. He hates any form of the occult, anything that involves itself with magic, anything that can be placed under these numerous categories that are spelled out here and that are translated various ways in different translations. There's God's attitude toward the occult. Was Israel perfect? Was she blameless, as this verse required of her before the Lord her God? Well, hardly. She falls into this snare just as she does with idolatry. As early as the earliest days of the monarchy, 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel makes reference to the occult and witchcraft. He said it's really almost better to be practicing that than to be in rebellion against the Lord. In we'll look at that passage. That's interesting enough in itself. Now, Saul's the first king, so that's how early we are in the monarchical period of Israel. Very early. And, of course, we're not that many years removed from the time of Moses. By the way, during the time of Joshua and the Judges, the books that come between this, we don't have references that are like this. We have to get over into this period. Of course, the patriarchs were in Palestine, so they had the same Canaanites and Amorites and the other ites around them, but they were one individual, or one family, where now we have the whole nation in here. You have more people to fall into the snare of the magical practices of the nations that live in Palestine. Verse 23, rebellion is as the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. He gives us both of the practices there. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And if that's not enough in Saul's life, in chapter 28, the whole chapter deals with Saul going to a witch, a necromancer, really, to call up the dead. And, of course, he wants her to call up Samuel. He's getting no revelation from God. Prophets aren't speaking to him. The divine means and methods of the Urim and the Tumim are not revealing anything to him. And so, of all things, he goes to the devil for help. Verse 3, Samuel was dead. All Israel had mourned for him and buried him. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. The Philistines here have assembled. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, and the Lord did not answer. By dreams, by the Urim, by the prophets. And Saul said to his attendants, "Then find me a woman who's a medium." And he himself had expelled them, so I may go and inquire of her. And they said, "There's one in Endor, the famous witch of Endor." So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." The woman said, "Surely you know that what Saul has done. He's cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. And why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" And Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." And notice what she said, "Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Because that was the Mosaic commandment, capital punishment for a medium. And he swears to her, of all things, the irony involved here, he swears to her by the Lord, who commanded that such a woman be put to death, that she would not be put to death. Of all things, there's irony involved here, obviously, to swear by the Lord, who said, "Don't do things like that." She said, "Whom shall I bring up?" He said, "Samuel." The woman saw Samuel. She cried at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "You're Saul." The king said, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." Described him, an old man wearing a robe. And Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground, and so forth. The early period of the monarchy here. Now, you can go from 1 Samuel 28 right on through, well, not the end of 2 Samuel, because that doesn't deal with the same things that the end of 2 Kings and Chronicles deal with. So from the end of 1 Samuel right on through the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, they're detailing the same events. The end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, the fall of Judah.
For the continuing.
So from the end of 1 Samuel right on through the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, they're detailing the same events. The end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, the fall of Judah. In other words, a period of about 4.5 centuries or so, from the beginning to the end of the monarchy. 4.5, 5 centuries. Israel is deeply involved in the occult. And that's due to the fact that she's deeply involved in idolatry. And many expressions of idolatry among the heathens concern magical incantations and practices. And therefore, to be involved in one would necessarily involve that individual with the other equally so. What about the origin of these practices? Well, they seem to have originated in the nations of Mesopotamia, particularly in the nations of Mesopotamia. Look at Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 6. This is a very interesting reference to the occult and Israel's relation to the occult, way over in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 6. We don't have to look. We're going to look at some of the concluding references here in a moment, the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. But throughout them you find here and there references to the occult. Isaiah 2:6, you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob. Isaiah's, speaking to the Lord. You have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob. They are full of superstitions from the east. Well, that would be Babylon. That would be Assyria and Persia, those ancient nations in the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent or Mesopotamia. And they practice divination like the Philistines, so it's not confined to the nations of the east. If we're going to judge east and west from the eastern shore of the Mediterranean way over to the eastern regions of Tigris and Euphrates, then we're back to the west now with the Philistines and clasp hands with pagans. Well, I think that is one hint of the origin, at least it predominated in the east. They are full of superstitions from the east. The east, such nations as Babylon. Isaiah 47, verses 8 through 15, is a critique and rebuke of Babylon and her evil practices, and one of these notable ones being magical practices. Isaiah 47, verses 8 through the end of the chapter. Now then listen, you wanton creature, lounging in your security, and saying to yourself, I am, and there is none besides me. I will never be a widow or suffer the loss of children. Both of these will overtake you in a moment, on a single day, loss of children and widowhood. They will come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and all your potent spells, trying to keep calamity and diversity away from her. He said it'll come on you, both widowhood and the loss of children, in spite of these protests of yours. You have trusted in your wickedness and have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, I am, and there is none besides me. Disaster will come upon you, and you will not know how to conjure it away. A calamity will fall upon you that you cannot ward off with a ransom. A catastrophe you cannot foresee will suddenly come upon you. We know he's predicting the fall of Babylon. Keep on then. Now watch some of these verses. Keep on then with your magic spells, and with your many sorceries, which you have labored at since childhood. Well, childhood, the childhood of the nation of Babylon, since her very inception, her early beginning days, she was involved in the occult. Perhaps you will succeed, perhaps you will cause terror. Again, irony. All the counsel you have received has only worn you out. Let your astrologers come forward, those stargazers who make predictions month by month. Let them save you from what is coming upon you. We have the same thing today in the world. People who look at the stars and try to predict, your life or disposition or temperament. Surely they're like stubble. The fire will burn them. They cannot even save themselves. That is all they can do for you. These you have labored with and trafficked with since childhood. Each of them goes on in his error, and there's no one who can save you. Book of Daniel, in the setting, the early chapters of Babylon. Daniel 2:2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and who does he call first? Not Daniel, but all of the astrologers, the soothsayers, as King James says, magicians, all of the people involved in the occult. In chapter 4, we have another revelation to Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 4 and verse 7. And again, he calls for these, and they can't interpret, and he has to call for Daniel. In Revelation, chapter 18, however you want to interpret the identity of the Babylon of Revelation 14, 17, and 18, there certainly is a play on the literal Babylon of the Old Testament. Chapter 18, verse 2, with a mighty voice he shouted, because a lot of this is just quoted from the Old Testament, in Isaiah particularly. Fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home of demons and a haunt for every evil spirit and a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. And maybe most interesting of all magical or occult verses in the Old Testament. Now, Deuteronomy 18 is probably the best known. But most interesting, where do you think that is? The most unusual, weird, strange, just an unusual reference. Only one we have in Scripture. We have some references in extra-biblical literature to this, and that helps us know what's going on here. It's in Ezekiel 21:21. And it does concern Babylon again. Ezekiel 21. Let's start with verse 18. NIV gives us a new paragraph there. So let's start with Ezekiel 21:18. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, mark out 2 roads for the sword. Remember, Ezekiel's kind of living before and into and during the period of the Babylonian captivity. Of the king of Babylon to take, both starting from the same country. Make a signpost where the road branches off to the city. Mark out 1 road for the sword to come against Rabbah of the Ammonites, and another against Judah and fortified Jerusalem. Of course, the territory of Ammon lay east of Judah, and so the king of Babylon would traverse that before he'd ever reach Palestine. 21. For the king of Babylon will stop at the fork in the road, at the junction of the two roads, to seek an omen. He will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols. He will examine the liver. Into his right hand will come the lot for Jerusalem, where he has to set up battering rams to give the command to slaughter, to sound the battle cry, to set battering rams against the gates, to build a ramp, and to erect siege works. It will seem like a false omen to those who have sworn allegiance to him, but he will remind them of their guilt and take them captive. Well, it's a thing of casting arrows and looking into the liver. And I think that's probably very similar to what the KJV has. The language, anyway, to me, sounds very similar from what I remember. KJV 21:21. For the king of Babylon stood at the parting of the way, at the head of two ways, to use divination. He made his arrows bright. And really the Hebrew just says that he shook his arrows. I have made and bright marked out and the word shook written in. He shook his arrows. He consulted with images. He looked in the liver. Ezekiel 21:21. We've got three things here then. He shook his arrows. He consulted with images. Those are just little gods he carried around with him, little statues there. And he looked in the liver. Well, what's going on here is he's trying to determine, to figure out which way he should go here. And so that he's going to put arrows in his quiver, and it's like rolling dice. Shake them, or shake one, we don't know how many, but shake it up and dump it out, let's say maybe one, and see which way the arrow points. And by that, it's kind of like playing spin the bottle whenever you were a child, and it's on you, then that's the person that gets kissed or whatever. Where's it pointing? You dump this out. You dump the area out and find which way it's pointing. Consult images. Look in the liver. Well, they had slaughter, they had sacrifice, a beast with them. And he would have, just like having sorcerers and magicians and all of this, men who were trained in the occult arts, magical practices, and they would rip open the liver and look at the inside of the liver. Depending on how things were arranged in the internal state of the liver, that would give him certain information as to what he should do. So that's probably the most unique, the most interesting reference in the Bible to occult practices, the fact of shaking the arrows and looking into the liver. And then maybe right behind that would be over in Isaiah chapter 8 in verse 19. These found here in these big prophetical books, Isaiah, and Jeremiah has a little to say about it as well. I don't think as much so as Isaiah and Ezekiel. But Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 19. When men tell you to consult mediums and spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? When they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God? For the living to the dead, didn't give us the whole sentence, but NIV gives us the whole sentence. There's probably the second most interesting one, of peeping and muttering. Seems to have reference to ventriloquism. So Babylon is certainly indicted as being one of the nations for the origin of the occult. Assyria is also indicted as being a place, a mother of sorceries and witchcraft. The little prophet Nahum chapter 3. Verse 1, it's a prophecy. Chapter 1:1, an oracle concerning Nineveh. So we're talking about Assyria. Chapter 3:1, woe to the city of blood. prophesying her doom, the crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses, jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords, glittering spears, will mean many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses, all because the fall of Assyria, all because of the wanton lust of a harlot alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution, I'm sure in a religious, occult sense, idolatrous sense, not literally or physically or bodily, and peoples by her witchcraft. So there's some nations in the eastern part of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, Babylon and Assyria by name, that seem to be the origin. But we can even go a little further to the south and to the west, and we come to Egypt. And Egypt is not without excuse in this regard. As early as Exodus chapter 7, in verse 11, Aaron cast down his rod, and it becomes a serpent. And for whom does Pharaoh call? But his sorcerers and his magicians, who through their incantations perform some similar act. Exodus chapter 7 and verse 11. Okay, now let's look then, a few more things we'll be through this evening. Let's look at the fall of Israel then. The fall of Israel and the fall of Judah. Let me start with Jeremiah 27, verses 8 through 10. It's how serious it is as far as God was concerned. We should have known that anyway from the fact that the penalty of death was leveled against those who practiced it. But even more so from the fact that Israel and Judah fell because of her idolatry and because of her occult associations. Chapter 27 of Jeremiah and verse 8. If, however, any nation or kingdom will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, or bow its neck under his yoke, I will punish that nation with the sword, famine, and plague, declares the Lord, until I destroy it by his hand. So do not listen to your prophets, your diviners, your interpreters of dreams, your mediums, or your sorcerers. Israel must have had all these, in other words, who tell you you'll not serve the king of Babylon. They prophesy lies to you that will only serve to remove you from your lands. I'll banish you and you'll perish. If you don't do what the true prophet Jeremiah is saying and serve the king of Babylon, you'll perish. Well, and I think probably sometimes the false prophets of the Old Testament were themselves actually involved, or were themselves actually the mediums and sorcerers and sorceresses and witches and warlocks and so forth. Because, notice, he gives this list here of your prophets. He said first, diviners and interpreters of dreams, mediums, sorcerers, and all of this. Not that you couldn't have one person who was not all of that together. And then he goes on who say, they prophesy lies unto you. They, not just the prophets, but all of these guys. Or women, they could be women involved, prophesy lies to you. Judah or Israel didn't have a corner on the market, but she had her share of the market as far as the occult was concerned. Now let's look at Israel, since she fell first. 2 Kings 17, a long passage, because this whole chapter deals with the fall of Israel and the causes of her fall. 2 Kings 17, verses 6 through 20. Long passage here, which really labors the point almost more than the passages which describe the reasons for the fall of the southern kingdom. 2 Kings 17, verses 6 through 20. We've got Hoshea now, last king. The king of Assyria has captured Samaria, verse 6, and deports the Israelites to Assyria. NIV gives us this heading, Israel exiled because of sin. Just general sin. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods. All right, we're back to idolatry. We didn't cover these passages last time. I wanted to save them till now. We had enough to look at then. But she fell because of her idolatry, because of her witchcraft. They worshipped other gods. They followed the practices of the nations, which were strictly forbidden in Deuteronomy 18. That the Lord had driven out, as well as practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. You remember we talked about Asherah. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that provoked the Lord to anger. It's just always they. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, "Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your fathers to obey and that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets." But they would not listen. They were stiff-necked as their fathers, who did not trust in the Lord their God. Stephen called the Pharisees and Sadducees that in his trial in Acts 7. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their fathers and the warnings he had given them. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, "Do not as they do." And they did the things the Lord had forbidden them to do. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made themselves two idols cast in the shape of calves. We talked about calf worship way back with Exodus 32 and Aaron making the golden calf and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts. Now there's the worship of the bodies of heaven. They worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination, sorcery, sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God because they followed the practices that Israel had introduced. Now he's just giving us a forewarning of the fact that the book is going to conclude with, "And Judah went into captivity just as did her sister Israel." Well, that's a rather lengthy passage. It's always, they did. I think he could have probably summed it up with the NIV's paragraph heading here, "Israel exiled because of sin." But he went on to detail and to enumerate all of this. And notice how it all deals with a rejection of the law, a rejection of the prophets that God had sent, a rejection of all of his commandments, but in what areas? You worshipped other gods. You don't find anything here about social injustice, about economic injustice or something, about sexual immorality. You worshipped other gods, and you practiced magical arts. Because of that, God gave them up. Judah. 2 Chronicles. We'll start with this, and we'll come back to the king's account of it. 2 Chronicles 33, verses 3 through 6. Now this is not the very end of Judah. That happens in chapter 36 with Zedekiah. Here we're back during the time of Manasseh, who was probably the worst king that Judah had. And he specifically is indicted as one who was grossly involved in the occult. 2 Chronicles 33, verses 3 through 6. He ruled a long time, 55 years. And he rebuilt. Well, now, if he rebuilt something that Hezekiah tore down, that meant that kings before him, kings before his father Hezekiah, had also practiced these things. It starts with Saul visiting the witch in 1 Samuel 28 and goes right through the end, the last chapter of 2 Kings and the last 2 Chronicles, right through the monarchical period. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. He also erected altars to the Baals, really to Baalim. That would be the Hebrew plural, but they're giving us the English here. And made Asherah poles. So we go back to Asherah all the time. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." In both courts of the temple of the Lord he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, the son of Hinnom, hence Gehenna, the term in the New Testament. Practiced sorcery, divination, witchcraft, consulted mediums, and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. All right, there is the view of Judah's fall from the point of view of the author of 2 Chronicles. From the point of view of the author of 2 Kings again, then, and now with regard to Judah, chapter 21, verses 3 through 7, the same episode in the life of Manasseh. He built the high places his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars to Baal and made an Asherah pole, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. Well, you see, all the kings are doing this. He bowed, all except a few, the righteous ones. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. In both courts of the temple of the Lord he built altars to all the starry hosts. He sacrificed his own son in the fire, practiced sorcery and divination, consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. He took the carved Asherah pole he had made and put it in the temple, of which the Lord had said to David and to his son Solomon, in this temple and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. And he put a carved pole of Asherah, a carved Asherah pole in the temple. Of all things, as pagan and as degenerate as you could be. And then as a result, of course, you have the fall here in chapter 25 of 2 Kings, and in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 you have the fall. Manasseh is a very bad king, perhaps the worst of all the kings of Judah, and he comes right here at the tail end of the monarchical period. So she falls as a result of that. Okay, then let's go back in conclusion then to how we began this evening. We saw what the Babylonian captivity, the fall of Judah, did for her as far as idolatry. Then, as you know, the question would be, did it do the same as far as the occult is concerned? As Judah goes into Babylon, she must be even closer to idolatry and the occult, because she's in Babylon of all places, and yet being in Babylon somehow cures her of idolatry. Well, again, go back to the post-exilic prophets, and what do you find? Again, go back to the gospel writers. What do you find? Does Jesus ever deal, of all the gospels, think about that, occult, magic practices, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You don't find that being dealt with there. Therefore, it's unusual if you'll jump over to the book of Acts, and probably an exception to the rule, when you have passages like Acts 8 and Acts 13. Acts 19 is self-explanatory. But what about Acts 8, verses 9 to 11? We're up in Samaria, but still these people are in some way related to the Jewish people. And lo and behold, here's what we find. Now for some time a man named Simon had practiced sorcery in the city and amazed all the people of Samaria. He boasted that he was someone great, and all the people, both high and low, gave him their attention and exclaimed, "This man is the divine power known as the great power." And you know, Philip, the evangelist, comes and preaches and wins the people of Samaria from false views, and evidently doesn't win Simon, at least not all the way. If you don't get one all the way, as far as I'm concerned, you don't get one then. But he's obviously a Jew, and a name like Simon, I mean, that's Simeon in the Old Testament. Simon, that's a good Jewish name. But I think this would be an exception to the rule that most of the Jews are not involved in the occult, and they're not involved in idolatry. That in chapter 13 and verse 6. And let me mention something now about both of these passages then. Notice that neither one of them are in Israel, Judah proper. One is up in Samaria, and maybe it could be explained because of the Samaritan influence there. And, of course, the other is overseas. Chapter 13 on the island of Cyprus. Chapter 13 and verse 6. They traveled through the whole island until they came to Paphos. There they met a Jewish sorcerer and a false prophet. He was both a Jewish sorcerer and a false prophet named Bar-Jesus, who was an attendant of the proconsul Sergius Paulus. Elymas the sorcerer, verse 8, tried to oppose them and turn Paulus from the faith. And Saul, who's called Paul, looked at him and said, "You're a child of the devil." Now, this is a Jew, but notice where he lives. Maybe he's come under Gentile influence then. The other place in the New Testament is chapter 19 of Acts, verses 18 through 19. Paul has had a great revival in the city of Ephesus. He convinces the people that Jesus is the Lord and he is the Christ. And they bring all of their superstitious books, their scrolls, their magical arts, and burn them. And Luke tells us they were valued at 50,000 pieces of silver, 50,000 drachmas. And with a drachma being a day's wage, and you've got 50,000 of them, that's over 100 years worth of daily work by one man. That's how much this was valued at, 50,000 drachmas. Well, that's Gentiles, so no problem there. Yes, I think that evidently the Babylonian captivity also cured them of their occult superstitions as well. Therefore, what I find interesting is what are their discussions about in the Gospels? Theirs where not the latter prophets, the post-exilic prophets, because they're so short and they're just preaching material. There in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have the most definitive and the most enlightening look at the Jewish people, because you have all of this going on with Jesus and his ministry. And then I kind of wonder how much of a parallel is intended between what happened then and what's happened in the church. The church, many centuries ago, the Roman Catholic Church, which was the only church, filled with the occult and superstition. And today, our problems with the church in general are generally not of an idolatrous or an occult nature. It's theological arguments, doctrinal arguments. People want to split hairs over this. People have departed from the faith and the doctrine and the theology of the New Testament as it was originally given and intended. And isn't that the same problem Jesus had with the religious leaders there? No discussions about the occult or idolatry. They're all theological, all legal questions, all the law, the prophets, the writings, biblical, scriptural questions. Those are the arguments. In other words, the people, in one sense, have degenerated. They've gone just from open rebellion against God, idolatry and the occult, to a very subtle form of rebellion against God, where Jesus said, you cast God's law behind your back and you teach for your doctrines the commandments of men. It's more subtle, and therefore it's almost worse of a degeneration of the nation of Israel. And our church today is generally not involved in a lot of sorcery and the occult. Here and there you find exceptions. Theological problems. Theological problems. Well, the end of the Bible, Revelation 21:8. God said all sorcerers will have their place in the lake of fire. Revelation 22, verses 14 to 15. The Bible, although it doesn't begin with sorcery and the occult, both of the last two chapters have one little note about it. Revelation 21:8, Revelation 22, 14 to 15. The first passage, they'll have their place in the lake of fire, and the second passage, outside of the gates of the heavenly city, will be dogs and sorcerers. So, just like with idolatry, I don't think that this matter, and we're building to something, I hope you notice, we're building to something in our religious study of the backgrounds of the period between the Testaments, and therefore of understanding the New Testament setting and its theology. I don't think that sorcery, witchcraft, the occult's a problem. That's why we're working our way quickly through the pagan side of it. And what are we headed toward? Judaism. Judaism, which Jesus said was such a bondage to the people that you've laden them with burdens that weight them down that you won't touch with one of your fingers. No problem with idolatry, worshiping Jupiter or Molech. No problem with the occult. The Pharisees and Sadducees practicing a little hypnosis on Solomon's porch or something, practicing a little incantation or a magical spell over there. They're not involved in any of that stuff. It's theological argument and debate, which, according to the Scriptures, and which, according to our experience, is even more difficult to deal with, because they quote Scripture. And that's what we're headed toward, Judaism. That's where Israel is religiously in the New Testament. Not with these other things we're looking at leading up to that. She's with Judaism. That's why we're headed toward that, and we'll spend most of our time there.